Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Manvir Singh. This is our third time together. He is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Davis. I will be leaving links to our first two interviews in the description, and we're going to talk today about his book, Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. So, Dr. Singh, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ricardo. Always a pleasure to be on.
So, let's start perhaps with the most basic question here. What is shamanism?
Yeah, so it's a basic question. It's also a highly debated question. So the way that I define it in the book, which follows some other scholars, is a practice in which a specialist enters a non-ordinary state, also called trance, sometimes called ecstasy. I'm thinking about all of those similarly, just non-ordinary behavior, non-ordinary state, to engage with unseen realities, often unseen agents, and provide services like healing and divination. So I think those three features, for my definition at least, are critical. The altered states, the unseen realities or unseen agents, and the healing, divination, or other services.
And how old is shamanism in human societies? Do we have a good idea of that?
I mean, that is also a very debated question. So in the book, I argue that it is very old, that it's probably as old as cognitive modernity or behavioral modernity. So as long as we have been behaviorally and cognitively recognizably human, I argue that we've probably had shamanism. But it's hard to get, of course, archaeological evidence or other evidence the farther back you go.
Mm-hmm. And what kinds of evidence can we draw from when trying to determine whether shamanism was present in prehistoric societies?
Yeah, so I would say there are a couple different strategies or a couple different domains of evidence. One is essentially evidence from the past. So some people will point to burials, they will point to rock art, they will point to headgear that is found in archaeological contexts. These are all interesting and they are helpful to some degree, but they're also very hard to interpret. So some people are very eager to interpret particular finds as evidence of shamanism or evidence of buried shamans. You know, it might be a woman who is deformed, who is buried with all kinds of animal bones and is buried in a very particular way. And people, there are a couple examples like this where people have called those buried shamans, but it's actually very hard to confirm that. It's very easy to fall into this kind of interpretive gymnastics where you want to see something, but it's actually open to many more interpretations. And something goes similarly for rock art. So there's some rock art that people have argued was produced by shamans in these trance states. Other rock art people will argue actually depicts shamans, but that is, again, very open to interpretation, open to debate. So that's one way of making this claim. But another way, there are two other related ways. One is to actually look at shamanism among contemporary societies. So shamanism is ubiquitous. It's found among almost all hunter-gatherer societies. And so on that basis, we can infer that it was likely present among our ancestors. And we can infer that there are two forms of inference you can make there. One is insofar as human societies today have shamanism, then it seems that there is something about our minds, our cultures, that predisposes shamanism to emerge. Other people will say that look at shamanism around the world, you see it everywhere. That means that some common cultural ancestor had shamans, that some African Edenic population had shamanism and then it diffused to all of them. Now, I disagree with this second interpretation, but the point more generally is that because shamanism is so ubiquitous among contemporary societies, it suggests that it was probably also present among our ancestors. So that's the second domain of evidence. And then the third is kind of a more psychological approach. Shamanism seems to really reflect and gel with our psychology, and we can kind of dig into that. But based on that, then you can also start to argue that it probably was very compelling to our ancestors' psychology as well.
Mhm. Yes, we're going to come back to that bit about the sort of psychological foundations of shamanism in a bit. Uh, but how common is shamanism across human societies? Is it a human universal or anything close to a human universal?
Yeah, so it is near universal. So if we think about hunter-gatherers, there was a study by Peoples et al. Um, I think they missed a couple examples, but that would suggest it's, maybe among 95% of hunter-gatherers. Other societies suggest, or other studies suggest that it's uh, at a similar frequency among non-industrialized societies. Um, And we should recognize that by the definition that I'm using, this would include mediums, it would include many prophets, it would include trance channelers, what are often called witch doctors, individuals who are entering these non-ordinary states, engaging with unseen realities and providing services. So it's ubiquitous, it's near universal. There are a couple of societies in which we don't find it, but those are very interesting very often. So some of the hunter-gatherer societies that we know lacked shamanism in recent history. We can actually infer that they had it a couple centuries ago, and then they lost it. So groups like the Ache or the Siriono, these very small mobile hunter-gatherers that you find in South America, who actually seem like refugees, or like they underwent some really catastrophic demographic collapse during which they lost cultural complexity. And you find something similar among other hunter-gatherers. So among those hunter-gatherers that do not have shamanism, they tend to be very small populations, and we can infer that potentially they had shamanism in history, or that they're just not at a large enough population size to sustain a certain level of cultural complexity.
And you have done work on shamanism in different societies. Tell us, for example, about the work you've done in, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Siberut and the Sikere.
Yeah, so that is where I've done most of my fieldwork and most of my research. I've been going to Siberut, great job at the pronunciation, since 2014. Um, and part of the reason that I was interested in Siberut, so Siberut is this island, it's off the west coast of Indonesia. So it's Southeast Asia. It's actually, if you go from Africa and you cross over the Indian Ocean, it's, arguably one of these first islands, or the first island that you'll hit. And as a result, it actually has very good waves, and a lot of surfers like to surf around Siberut. So it's interesting. You go there, you'll find anthropologists and like Australians who are going to nearby islands or going surfing. But anyway, so yeah, I've been going to Siberut since 2014. And when I arrived, so I've been working with this group, the Mentawe. They are rainforest horticulturalists. So they grow palm trees and tubers and fruit trees, and then they hunt, and they also raise pigs and livestock. And I got there. I talk about the experience of arriving. It was like complicated, hard. But very soon after I arrived, it became very apparent that there were certain individuals in this society who had kind of a social magnetism. These are individuals who were very often tattooed. They wore loincloths. They kept their hair. They would paint themselves in turmeric. They had a kind of social gravity. So they would step into a scene, and you can kind of feel the social milieu or the social environment bend towards them. And these were the Sikere, the shamans of Mentawe. And the Sikere are at the nexus of political life, of medicinal life, of religious life. They are understood to be distinct from normal humans, to have special eyes, to be able to see souls. And they heal people in these healing ceremonies that can go on for several days, where they dance, they fall into trance. And so just going to Mentawe and experiencing this institution was really striking. It just how prominent they were in the society and how important. It made me very curious about the institution. But then there was also something honestly kind of like phantasmagorically fascinating, or the culture was so rich, but also so otherworldly. It was just a very intriguing research topic. So that is what really sprung me into the world of shamanism.
So those sort of, I think we can call them social markers, like, for example, when you mentioned that the shamans there would I mean would have tattoos and would have I think you mentioned also different kinds of clothing. So is that something that we also see across societies? I mean, do the shamans always have social markers that to distinguish themselves from the other people?
Yeah, I would say frequently. And some of those can be visual, but some of those can kind of be, we might call it narrative or mythological, or in terms of how people understand them. So in Mentawe, they are set off in a couple of ways. They have these tattoos, they have the loincloths, they have the long hair, but then they also don't, they have to taboo themselves, so they cannot eat a lot of food, they can't have sex very often. But then they also go through this initiation, which I write about in the book, where there are many things that happen to them during the initiation, but one of them is like a fundamental transformation of their eyes. Their eyes are regularly treated. They're treated socially. They're treated in the secrecy of the forest. And so it's also this understanding that they have different kind of eyes, that they have fundamentally transformed, that also sets them off. So they're marked both in people's understandings of them, but also aesthetically, if that's clear.
Yeah. Are shamans both men and women, or is this kind of role gendered?
So it depends on the society. Mentawi is interesting. So the word sikere can refer both to a man and his wife, but it's typically the man who is kind of the shaman, who is falling into trance, who's doing these healing ceremonies. There's a general anthropological wisdom, which I think is counterintuitive to many people, that the more egalitarian the society, the more likely it is that men are shamans. And as societies become more hierarchical, women are more likely to become shamans. But in some societies you'll have both men and women, but then also in some societies, shamans will have, they'll kind of transcend their normal gender binary. They might have elements of both. They might cross-dress. So yeah, it really depends on the context. I would say, on average, they seem to more often be men, though, which also reflects men kind of being more prominent often in religious and spiritual life.
Right. So, what are the psychological foundations of shamanism? Is there anything specific about our psychology that predisposes us towards shamanism and shamanic practices, or what kinds of cognitive mechanisms play a role here?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's a big question. So an argument that I make in the book is that shamanism recurs because it is a hyper compelling, essentially cognitive technology, a way of convincing people, of assuring people, of creating these simulated experiences where people can control uncertain outcomes. And so I view shamanism very much as a cognitive or psychological technology. And so I think a lot about these psychological foundations. We can think about those psychological foundations in a couple ways. One is more generally the psychological foundations of religion, of which there has been a lot of research. I know a lot of people have come to your show to talk about this.
Yes.
So people are predisposed to believe that agents, invisible agents exist, and they oversee uncertain outcomes, gods, spirits, ghosts, that they cause illness, that they cause misfortune. They're predisposed to engage in rituals and superstitions and forms of magic. So if there's an outcome I really want to control, I'm very predisposed to use a low-cost intervention to control it. So I have a big test coming up and I do all kinds of superstitions, or a family member is sick, I do all kinds of superstitions. So these are very important for shamanism, but they're also very important for religion more generally. The fact that we believe that agents exist and we use rituals or superstitions or magic to engage with them. So that gets us kind of to the basic elements of shamanism. The fact that at its foundation, shamanism is kind of a ritualistic practice to try to control the uncertain. But then that leaves open the question of, why does that have to look like shamanism? Why do you have people who are dancing, falling into trance, having death and rebirth ceremonies? Why does it have to take this particular form? And so the thing that I argue is most key is the intuition of transformation or difference. So at the core, what a shaman is doing is they are saying, I can do something normal humans cannot. I can speak to this god. I can see this trend. I can, battle witches. I can engage with these agents, these beings who are invisible to normal people. And the way that I make that credible, the way that I make that tenable, is by essentially diverging from normal humanity, by becoming a different kind of human. And we can see a similar intuition in superhero narratives. Like a superhero narrative is a story about this person who can do things normal people cannot, but the way that's made credible or tenable for the audience is through an origin story. They were bitten by a radioactive spider. They're an alien from another planet. Whatever, they were zapped by some radioactive whatever. They have some crazy genetic mutation. All of these are narratives to explain why this person differs fundamentally from normal humans. And so I think a lot about shamanism serves this function, promoting the sense that this is a fundamentally different kind of human and thus has abilities that us normal humans do not.
How about aspects of human sociality? Do they play a role in any way in the development of shamanism?
For sure. So a couple that I think are really critical and reasons that you do not see shamanism, for example, among chimpanzees. One is shamanism requires cultural evolution or complex culture. So you need to be a cultural species to develop these practices, elaborate them. But then shamanism is also, at the end of the day, a service. It's you go to someone, you give them resources, they provide a service in return. And so you need to have a degree of sociality where people can trust each other, where they can also provide, they're willing to engage in this kind of these kinds of service providing. So I think those are just necessary elements of a species to have something like shamanism. It has to be cultural. It has to be sufficiently cooperative. But then shamanism also ends up just intersecting so many domains of social life. So in Mentawai, shamans are very important mediators. They have political influence because they have this liminal status, because they're seen to be special from normal humans and to potentially have special powers that allows them to also take on political influence.
What kinds of attitudes do people from industrialized and post-industrial societies tend to have towards shamanism and its practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say people's viewpoints broadly separate into two categories. One is this view that shamanism is a kind of primeval wisdom, that it embodies this older spiritual relationship or more genuine connection to nature and to spirituality. It is a much more Edenic or rosy-eyed view of shamanism. And you can contrast that with a view that sees shamanism more as superstition, and we might say it's kind of related to images of savagery or backwardness, exploitation. Yeah, I would say these are two common stereotypes or paradigms, and they're often deployed in ways that are contingent on people's political or ideological goals. So if you want to critique post-industrial or industrialized societies, then you'll say, you can point to shamanism and say, oh, we've lost something, there's some genuine, real, important spiritual knowledge that has disappeared. But if you want to celebrate them, you can say, oh, post-industrialized societies have rid themselves of something like shamanism. Yeah, and I think often stereotypes or images of shamanism are linked to some view that people tend to have of non-Western societies, and how shamanism manifests in those stories depends on the kinds of arguments people want to make about industrialized societies.
Mm-hmm. But can we also find shamanism or shamanic practices in industrialized societies?
For sure. And something that I have been arguing is that what both of these views have in common is some fundamental separation between Western or industrialized societies and the rest of the world. And this view that has long been a part of the study of shamanism, or at least the popular discourse of shamanism, that pushes shamanism to the far off, to the past. I mean, Eliade's famous book is called Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. I think most people, if you go to Google Images and you type in shamanism, it's so wrapped up with images and imagery of primitiveness or the deep past. But instead, I think, just as shamanism has appeared in so many other societies, it manifests in contemporary industrialized societies. And it manifests in a couple ways. So one, it are actually literal shamans. So I think Pentecostal pastors are very often shamans. I mean, they are channeling or communing with a sky god or some invisible being. They are entering non-ordinary states. They're speaking in tongues. They're healing. I mean, you can just search on YouTube Pentecostal healing, and if it were any other tradition, we would very readily or easily call that shamanism. Trance channelers or mediums that you might find, on the streets of Los Angeles are paradigmatic shamans. I think many figures of the history of Abrahamic religions are shamans. So these, I would say, are literal shamans. They qualify as shamans by the definition that I describe in the book. There are also many shaman analogs in Western and industrialized societies, figures who are serving similar functions or who are supported by similar social and cognitive foundations. So in the book, I write about what I call hedge wizards. So money managers in particular, these individuals who are, despite actually being efficacious, promising some kind of insight or divinatory power into unseen trends to provide some people with a sense that they can control or understand the uncertain or uncontrollable. So I think similar dynamics are at play in all societies, and we often delude ourselves by denying the universality of these practices.
So let's talk about the relationship between shamanism and other particular kinds of religion. So historically, the shamanism ends when organized religion starts?
Yeah, so I think there's a common view, and you find this in some of the best contemporary books on the cultural evolution of religion, or the evolution of religion. So Robert Wright's The Evolution of God, for instance, that paint this picture or tell this story where shamanism is this oldest religion, and then it is replaced or it evolves into large-scale world religion. So Robert Wright has a quote in his book where he describes shamanism as a precursor on some evolutionary timeline that ends with eventually archbishops and ayatollahs. And in the book, I call this the Pokemon theory of shamanism. So as a child of the 90s who played a lot of Pokemon, it paints this picture where you have like this simpler, primitive evolutionary stage that then is replaced by this more complex form. But I think that actually really mischaracterizes how religious history very often works. And instead, something that I argue is that rather than ecstatic practice or shamanism evolving into these other forms, instead they are actually engaged in this constant competition and rivalry. So one thing that you actually see in a lot of histories of particular religious movements is that they will start off very shamanic, and then as they become institutionalized, as they become centralized, they attack that shamanic foundation. So you can find this in the history of the early Christian church. The early Christian church is, by everything we can tell, a very shamanic place. It's filled with altered states, with healing, with prophecy. But within a couple decades, as power is centralized in the bishops, there is an attack against charisma, against ecstatic performance. You see this in the history of Mormonism. Mormonism starts off again as a religion or as a movement that is very ecstatic, where you have speaking in tongues, you have healing, you have divination. But again, within a couple decades, you have key figures like Brigham Young. Brigham Young, who I believe is the second president of the Church of Latter-day Saints, the second prophet, early in his life or early in his time in Mormonism, was very enthusiastic about entering ecstatic states, about healing, about these gifts. He felt like it was an echo of the earliest church. But within a couple decades, he was not condoning it in the church. He said that to allow people to enter these kinds of states introduces competing doctrine. And that is essentially why organized religion has had this complicated relationship with shamanic practice. Insofar as you allow other people to enter altered states, to experience the divine in this very direct way, it provides or it enables competition in the connection with the divine. If I am an archbishop, I want to be the sole individual who can claim a relationship to divine, to divinity. I want to monopolize the ability to say things about doctrine, to prophecy. And if suddenly anyone in this community, anyone's grandma can enter trance, claim that she's, channeling a spirit, then that is threatening to my own authority.
How about prophets? I mean, for example, Judeo-Christian prophets, are they shaman-like figures?
Yeah, so we can think about prophets in two ways. One, we can think about prophets as they're described in the Hebrew Bible. And those, as far as we can tell, are very shamanic figures. I'm always like less comfortable about just doing this stuff from memory because I want to be very specific. So I just like had some notes up, but this word, so in the Hebrew Bible, I'm probably pronouncing this incorrectly, so forgive me for all the pronunciation, but the Hebrew prophets are referred to with this word nabi. And from what we can tell, if you look at how nabi is used in the Hebrew Bible, it is very shamanic. So it's non-ordinary behavior. It is often prophecy. There is some implication of a relationship with the divine. Here's 1 Samuel 10:6. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you and you will prophesy. So this is a derivation of the word nabi. It might be hit nabe with them and you will be changed into a different person. So you find this mention of a relationship with the divine, this non-ordinary behavior. There's 1 Samuel 19:24. He stripped off his garments and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. This is why people say Saul also among the prophets. So in the Hebrew Bible, the prophets are shamans. I think it's very hard to make the argument to the contrary. And I think insofar as people are uncomfortable with that, it just reflects a prejudice that puts shamanism and shamans into one bucket and Abrahamic religion into another. So yeah, I think early Abrahamic figures are easily qualify as shamans.
Is shamanism necessarily in conflict with organized religion?
Not necessarily. So organized religion has engaged with shamanic tendencies in different ways. So sometimes it has tried to quash it. So again, you see this in the early Christian church, you see this in Mormonism, but in other contexts, it tries to domesticate it. So you can see this in the relationship between Buddhism and shamanic practice in Japan. So in Japan, shamans, there are shaman mediums, and historically they were more salient. They were called miko. And early Buddhism tried to get rid of the miko. The miko is a local shaman medium. She becomes possessed, and then she can heal or divine. And of course, that competes with the Buddhist organization's power. But it was very difficult to get rid of the miko. The miko are very important to people. People want that kind of spiritual engagement. And so what Buddhism did, it weakened the miko as much as it could, but then it incorporated them into its religious organization. So it brought them to shrines. It kind of domesticated the practice. So I think there is a tension, but I don't think it always necessarily has to manifest as like destroying shamanism. I think it can have different ways of dealing with the appeal and competition that comes from shamanism.
Tell us about neo-shamanism, or how shamanism can resurge in societies where many people declare themselves as not affiliated with any religion.
Yeah, so that's a great comment, and that actually reminds me that when I was listing all of the forms of shamanism in industrialized and Western societies, I just forgot neo-shamanism, which is simple. So neo-shamanism is we might call it a trend or a kind of new agey movement in which people understand themselves to be practicing older shamanic traditions. And so a common tradition within contemporary neo-shamanism is called core shamanism. Core shamanism is interesting. It was started by an anthropologist turned essentially new age guru. This person, Michael Harner, did incredible research among the Shuar. But then he wrote this book, The Way of the Shaman, in which he argued that he was identifying some core feature of shamanism as it exists across societies, created that as a form of like bite-sized everyday practice, and that has become very popular. And what I think about the rise of neo-shamanism. So neo-shamanism and these related practices where people understand themselves to be engaging in shamanism have become very, very popular in Western society. So I think in the 2021 British census, shamanism was the fastest growing religion. Just people who said that they were practicing shamanism, it went, I think it multiplied by tenfold within 10 years. And there are more like self-proclaimed shamans in England and Wales than I believe there are Rastafarians or Zoroastrians. But the rise, I think, is partly related to something you gestured at, which is there has been a turn away from organized and institutionalized religion for a number of reasons. There's been a decline in people who affiliate with organized religion, but that is partly compensated by people who consider them spiritual but not religious. And I think shamanism appeals to them for a couple of reasons. I think one, it makes them feel like they're connecting with nature or some deep spirituality, some more universal spirituality, and that just partly depends on how it's packaged. But then secondarily, I think shamanism appeals to them for the same reason that shamanism has appealed to people everywhere, that there is something very compelling about this more intimate relationship with divine, with the ecstatic experience, and with using that relationship for everyday ends like healing and prophecy. People want to get something out of their relationship with the supernatural. They want to be healed. They want to know what's going to happen. And relationships or engagements with the supernatural that feel much more intimate, that feel much more experiential, that feel much more visceral, I think are much more compelling than ones where you have a number of intermediaries or a less kind of direct spiritual experience.
So you've already given us different examples of these, but what kinds of practices can we find in shamanism, and what kinds of rituals does it involve?
Yeah, so it's incredibly diverse. You have, so some common things are ascetic practice or self-denial. Of course, entering these non-ordinary states is very common, but the techniques to do so are incredibly diverse. So in Mentawe, shamans enter non-ordinary states through dancing and through drumming, but in other places, also places where I've worked or visited, they will use hallucinogens. They might use sensory deprivation, go into darkness. So that's another very salient or important dimension to it. You often have these dramatic initiations, which we've talked about. So in Mentawe, again, it's like the treatment of the eyes, but it might be a death and rebirth ceremony. In parts of Australia, it was understood that shamans would have their bodies open and crystals would be put inside. There might be like a ritual burial. Yeah, so then they can have these very dramatic initiations. Shamanism is closely linked to music, so very, very frequently. It's a ubiquitous, not necessarily universal, but widespread relationship between shamanic ritual and music. Displays of supernatural powers, or so like walking on fire, stabbing yourself with swords, but also speaking languages that you maybe do not know.
And what is a trance, and what are shamanic states of consciousness?
Yeah, so trance, again, is like a highly debated and complicated term. The way that I think about trance as it is common across shamanic practices is just non-ordinary behavior. And it can manifest in a huge diversity of ways. So in Mentawai, among the Mentawai, when shamans are entering trance, they will kind of shake in place, but in other places they might be incredibly still. It might be very violent. They might manifest the spirits that are understood to be embodying them. Also, the understandings of trance can be very diverse. So it might be that their soul is leaving their body. It might be that a soul is coming into their body. It might be that energy is boiling up through their body. It might be that spirits are coming and talking to them. So the techniques to induce it, the behavioral manifestations, and the general understandings of these states are incredibly diverse. But what they all have in common is a state that is behaviorally and psychologically distinct from normal human functioning.
And what psychological effects does trance have, and what kinds of practices produce it?
Yeah, so that is also somewhere where I diverge from some other people who have written about shamanism. So some well-known writers about shamanism, people like Michael Harner or Michael Winkelmann, have argued that shamanic trance states often share some fundamental similarities, that we can think about it essentially a shamanic state of consciousness. Mm-hmm. I think that's very hard to conclude. I think based on what we know about the psychological effects of these different techniques, these are actually characterized by incredible diversity. So in some states, there might be a kind of sensory overload. You might be hallucinating. You might be understanding yourselves to be engaging with unseen agents, traveling through worlds. In other, there might be very, very little sensory dynamics. In some, you might have a very strong sense of self. In other, you might lose your sense of self. In some, you might be very aroused. In others, you might not be aroused. And so my own work and review of the literature on altered states of consciousness has led me to conclude that there is very little that is shared among all of these traditions as they occur around the world. And instead, shamanism is kind of like is humanity's project of the explorations of the limitations and dimensions of consciousness. I mean, even within particular societies, shamans entered very different trance states. So in the book, I talk about some of these trance healers in Southern Africa who ingest different herbs to induce different states, and they understand them to have different effects. Some are kind of dream-inducing plants, some are closer to deliriums, and they understand these to be very psychologically different experiences.
Mm-hmm. And what are the functions of trance? I mean, tell us, for example, about the concepts of transformation and performance.
Yeah, so there are some people who would argue, so Michael Winkelmann, this big writer who has written a lot about shamanism and trance, and he has argued that trance has this integrative effect on cognition, that when shamans are entering trance, parts of networks that normally are not communicating are communicating in the brain, and that allows for insight. That means shamans are better at mediating and problem solving. But I think it's very hard to make a conclusion like that. I think it's very hard to argue that shamans across societies have some particular psychological effect of trance, just given how incredibly diverse it is. And so the way that I think about trance and what I argue is its most important function is a sense of transformation or otherness, both for the audience, but also for the specialist. So the thing that I think is an issue for shamanism, or the hurdle that I think any specialist needs to overcome, is why do you have the ability that you claim? My mother is sick. I feel like I'm being haunted by a witch. I want to know whether it will rain tomorrow, whatever, I have some kind of goal. I go to a specialist. I say, can you help me solve this issue? They say that they can. Why should I believe them? Why should I think that another human should have the powers that they claim? And this is where I think this fundamental transformation is necessary. They become a different kind of human. But I also think just the manifestation of that power should look very different. If you come to me, Ricardo, and you're like, Manvir, can you talk to the rain god? And I say, for sure. And I turn and I say, hello, rain god, how are you doing? That would not seem very credible. But if I enter a state that looks and feels fundamentally different from normal human functioning, I'm lying on the ground, it's darkness, I'm shaking, that makes it much more credible or tenable to you that I have the powers that I can. And so while I think that trance does have very important psychological effects, what I think is most important about it is that it's creating a very credible seeming experience for both audience and for practitioner. It is compelling to everyone involved that this person has some ability that normal humans do not. They have some experience that normal humans do not.
When it comes to rituals, what are initiations? How do they play out? And what are their goals?
Yeah, so initiations, I think, are doing a couple of things. So they might be a mechanism for providing a novice with information that they don't have, so teaching them, providing them with knowledge. They might be a mechanism for creating common knowledge, just that someone is shifting from one state to another. There's a very clear marker. Now you put on a particular hat, you're given a particular name, and now we know that you've transitioned from one state to another. But then again, what I think is so critical about shamanism is this fundamental transformation, and I think a lot of initiations are doing a lot to reinforce that sense. They are telling us that this is no longer a regular human, that Ricardo is no longer like the rest of us, that his body has transformed, his eyes have transformed. In Mentawe, or among the Mentawe, when a person is going from a regular person to a shaman, so they have these various rituals in which their eyes are transformed. They have various nights of trance dancing. They are understood to meet their ancestors for the first time. But then the terminology used to describe them also changes. So the Mentawe refer to non-shamans as simata, a word that is also used to refer to uncooked food or food that is not yet ripe, whereas they refer to shamans as sikere. And there's this sense, this intuition, that the initiation ripens you, it transforms you, it cooks you, that there is this transformation of your fundamental being so that you have these special abilities. And that, I think, is very critical to a lot of shamanic initiation.
So you've already mentioned some of these, but what kinds of social roles do shamans play in their societies?
Foremost is roles like healing and divination, but then very often they will take on secondary leadership roles. They might be mediators, arbitrators. They might have some political influence. They may have important roles in ceremonial life and life cycle transitions. So they might oversee initiations. I would say really, really critical, though, is, of course, just as healers, diviners, essentially providing these kind of miraculous services to everyday people. And then the other roles that they often have are implications of these central functions.
Do people believe in everything a shaman does? And if not, and if there are some cognitive contradictions, what does that tell us about shamanism and how people relate to it?
Yeah, so people do not believe everything. In fact, in most societies, you will find a lot of discourse about who is real, who is not real. Is this person faking trance? There is also sometimes articulated a skepticism about the reality of much of shamanism. So I think it's very easy to stand outside of a particular context and just treat everyone as undying believers. But in fact, something that I've been really struck by throughout my research just on the evolution of religion is how much more cognitively sophisticated, skeptical, discerning people are. And so I think there are a couple important dimensions to that. One, so I think the entire experience of writing this book and thinking about shamanism and religion more generally has made me think about belief in a different way. I think it's easy to come from a tradition a Western tradition, which is the scholarly tradition that I work within, that has been very influenced by the Christian discourse, where belief is believed to be fundamental. So I act a particular way because of my beliefs. I respond to the world in a particular way because of my beliefs. But my research on shamanism has made me start to think about how our responses to the world and our beliefs about the world are sometimes at odds. So I might engage in magic or superstition, but also be skeptical or not sure of whether it works. I might go to a shamanic initiation or ritual. I might be healed. I might have mixed expectations or a half belief in whether it works, but that actually doesn't necessarily change the fact that I might still therapeutically respond to it. So yeah, this entire project has made me think that belief is maybe less critical than we are sometimes apt to believe ourselves.
And does shamanism actually work? Yeah, and if so, what it is in shamanism that specifically makes it work?
Yeah, so I'm a materialist, I'm an empiricist. And so do I think that shamans are engaging with unseen beings and providing services through that engagement? Do I think that, the shaman is talking to a crocodile god or a sky god? Based on the current evidence, I don't think we can necessarily conclude that. And I present evidence. I try to treat that position with respect, but I think based on our existing evidence, we can conclude that. Do I think that shamans are sometimes therapeutically healing people, or do I think they're providing therapeutic benefits? When I started this work, in earlier periods, I was much more skeptical. I thought there are some people who are so enthusiastic about saying that shamans are healers and they provide these therapeutic benefits, and I felt that they were often doing so more from a desire for what shamanism should be than from a serious and responsible engagement with the empirical evidence. After having written this book, after studying it a lot, I am much more convinced that shamanism sometimes has therapeutic effects, or it has the capacity to provide therapeutic effects. And I think about that through several different mechanisms. One, I think shamanism is a really potent or powerful way to change a person's understanding of themselves. And this is what psychotherapy is often doing in maybe more familiar Western context. But a patient goes into a shamanic healing ceremony with some story or some expectation about themselves. And then the shamanic ceremony is this powerful, very vivid way of transforming that story. I'm haunted by witches, or the crocodile spirit is here to get me. I have this very powerful experience. The shaman battles them, it removes them from my house, it puts them in the river. And I come away with a different story. Oh, I'm not haunted anymore. And in the book, I actually talked to a well-known psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins who calls himself a shaman because he understands his role in precisely this way. He has to dress himself in signals of authority, enact a powerful transformation so that the patient's story about themselves changes. So that is one thing that I think shamanism is doing in many cases. Another is that I think it is a potent way to induce the placebo effect. And the experience of writing that book and studying shamanic healing ceremonies also, I think, reinforced for me that it can induce the placebo effect even in the absence of whether people do or do not believe in it. People can come, but it is the experience of being healed that seems to often just lead to reduced pain or anxiety, regardless of belief. And I think that's a very interesting topic about how is the placebo effect being induced even in the absence of belief. The final thing that I think is often very important for shamanic healing ceremonies is that they are incredibly, very often, social, celebratory, festive events. So coming from a Western context, I think I had expected healing often to be something that's much more somber, much more sober, and was struck when with the Mentawe and finding that a ceremony would essentially become a party. It would, the shamans would come, they would heal a person, animals would be sacrificed, then we're feasting, then the shamans would dance, but at some point they would stop dancing, and then other people would stay up dancing, and everyone would try to stay up all night, and everyone, all the friends and the family are there. observing these healing ceremonies, I was very struck by the fact that they were often much more festive and celebratory than I had expected,
Mhm.
and
Right.
social.
But when it comes to healing specifically, could it be that at least part of the effects are placebo effects?
Yeah, so I think there are good reasons to actually suspect that shamanic healing ceremonies are inducing the placebo effect. And in fact, I think shamanic healing ceremonies are very well geared or very well designed to induce the placebo effect. And there are two mechanisms that I would want to highlight. The first is just how sensory or visceral or engrossing the experience is. So there's research showing that sham surgery induces a stronger placebo effect than giving someone a sugar pill or doing some massage. And if you think about shamanic healing ceremonies, they are incredibly engrossing. You know, it's a practitioner who is fighting a spirit at night. There's fire, there's music, there's dancing, there's trance. It is a much more sensorially vivid experience. And so for that reason, we would expect a stronger placebo effect. The second reason is that research has shown that people have a stronger placebo effect when they feel that a practitioner cares about them more, when that practitioner is more empathic, when they just have a more intimate relationship with them. And shamanism, I think, is that for two reasons. One, you're surrounded by friends and family, but then secondarily, you have someone who's coming out and not only healing you, but often doing so in ways that are understood to be risky for them. So the Kung, these Kalahari hunter-gatherers, trance was called half death. It was understood that this person was approaching death. In many contexts, shamans are fighting for the patients. It feels like the entire community is fighting for them. And I think so both of these we should expect to produce a stronger therapeutic effect through the placebo effect.
Okay, so for the last part of our conversation, we have to talk a little bit about psychedelics here, not just because they have recently sort of gone mainstream, but also because people tend to make some claims about their use in traditional society. So, what are psychedelics and why do people link them to shamans?
So when people talk about psychedelics, I think they tend to talk about them in two ways. Some people use the word psychedelic to just refer to hallucinogens more generally, but then many people are using the word psychedelic to refer to a particular kind of substance or compound. It's drugs that have an effect on the serotonin HT2A receptor. Ricardo, I want to make sure that that's correct.
Okay, no problem.
Serotonergic psychedelic. 5-HT2A. Okay, can we do that question again?
Yes, I will repeat the question. Okay, so for the last part of our conversation, we have to talk here a little bit about psychedelics, not just because they have recently sort of gone mainstream, but also because many people make claims about their use in traditional society. So, what are psychedelics and why is it that people tend to link them to shamans?
That's a great question. So when people are talking about psychedelics, they tend to use that term in one of two ways. First is to refer to hallucinogens more broadly. Some people might even call marijuana a psychedelic under that use. But then when many people are talking about psychedelics, they're talking about compounds with a specific neurological effect, these that are acting on the serotonin 5-HT2A receptors. And so these are compounds like LSD, psilocybin, psilocin, 5-MeO-DMT, DMT, bufotenine. And so as these serotonergic psychedelics have become more popular, you often find this claim that psychedelics have been used in shamanic contexts around the world and for millennia. And I think part of the reason you find this claim so often is that it softens the edge around something that otherwise might seem a little scary. oh, we should legalize this, oh, you should feel more comfortable about it being in clinical contexts, because this has been a part of human spiritual life, about human medicinal life, about human ritual and therapeutic life for millennia and in cultures around the world. And in fact, often when I talk to people about shamanism or about my fieldwork, they not only expect that the Mentawe use drugs or hallucinogens, but they might even, in particular, expect them to use psychedelics. And for the context, Mentawe shamans do not use psychoactive substances to induce trance. I mean, they smoke tobacco, like many people in that society. The way that they enter trance is through dancing and drumming. So I think this claim is made very widely in the popular discourse that psychedelics have been used in shamanic contexts for millennia. But I think it's inaccurate, or at least I think it really misrepresents human history and diversity. And I can talk a bit about why.
Yeah, tell us about why then.
So I think it misrepresents human diversity and history in a couple ways. The first is, what is the actual evidence that people around the world have used psychedelics? And the best work for this, or the best attempt to answer this question, was done by a French PhD student, Martin Fortier. So Martin went through the diaries of explorers and adventurers. He went through old ethnographic documentation. He went through ethnobotanical work. He was building this incredible project. Unfortunately, he died while he was working on the project. Really tragically, he was 30 years old. He died of cancer. But he presented some of his findings before he had passed. And so we should treat these as preliminary. But as best as he could tell, serotonergic psychedelics have only been used in Meso and South America. Nowhere else in the world do we have reliable evidence, so observational evidence or ethnobotanical evidence of the hallucinogenic use of serotonergic psychedelics. It's only in Mesoamerica and South America. And even in those regions, it seems to have been used by a very small number of cultures. So he estimates that I think 5% of ethno-linguistic groups in the Americas were using serotonergic psychedelics in hallucinogenic doses. And so on a global scale, that would be something like 1% of ethno-linguistic groups. So a tiny slice of humanity has used these particular kinds of compounds. Then there's also the question of how they have been used. And so I think often the discourse wants to draw a parallel between modern therapeutic or clinical applications and what is understood to be indigenous use. There's this image that the shaman is presenting a psychedelic to the patient and that they are consuming it, and that is somehow related to psychological healing. In fact, the prevailing way that psychedelics were used in these contexts is that the shaman themselves, the specialist, would consume the substance, and they would consume the substance as a way of accessing supernatural powers, as a way of divining, as a way of battling enemies, as a way of diagnosing illness. There's a really striking video that Napoleon Chagnon took among the Yanomama, where they had taken a psychedelic snuff and then used that to attack babies, as they understood it, in an enemy group. So the usage that is often described in the popular psychedelic discourse is very different than what you see in the societies that they're claiming to represent. And I should point out that it's not only that shamans are taking it, you have an incredible diversity of uses of psychedelic substances. You have apprenticeships, you have situations where all of the men are taking it together for all-night dances. You have it where many individuals are taking it for some shared supernatural or spiritual experience. They might understand themselves to be traveling beyond the Milky Way. But it's all nevertheless very, very different than it is often described in the popular psychedelic literature.
So just one last question about that. Why do you think that people in industrialized societies come up with these claims?
Like I said, I think it's about making psychedelics seem more approachable. And for the record, I have no problem with making reasoned arguments and drawing on data to show why there should be broader acceptance of psychedelics, or why clinical trials might suggest psychedelics are useful for therapeutic or clinical purposes. But I think when people start to imagine or make up claims about human cultural diversity to support these monetary or ideological goals, I think that is very irresponsible. I think it projects this very simplistic image onto human cultural diversity. It mangles it in service of the kinds of goals that people are having. And I think it does a disservice to the project more generally of having a better understanding or better characterizing how people have used drugs across human societies. Yeah.
Great. So the book is, again, Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. Of course, I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And apart from the book, where can people find your work on the internet?
So they can find it on my website, manvir.org, manvir.org. I also have a Twitter, I have an X account, MNVR SMGH, and I have a Blue Sky, Manvir, I think it's bluesky.social, the standard format. And yeah.
Okay, great. So I will also add that to the description. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a great pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for having me, Ricardo. I always enjoy it. And I enjoy your show more generally. I think you're doing an amazing thing. I like to work out while listening to your podcast or watching your show so that I can learn something fascinating about any topic.
Well, thank you. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.